We're going to pursue the presence of Jesus together as a church, then we must be people of radical devotion. I want to define devotion for us really quickly, and I want to try to make it as simple as possible. But devotion simply is a willingness to do whatever it takes for more of God. That's all it is. When we talk about devotion, what are we talking about? What kind of life are we calling ourselves to? A life of devotion is a life that's being lived, that where we're willing to do whatever it takes for more of God, to experience more of Him, to have more of Him, to have more intimacy with Him, to be more committed to Him. We just want to have a willingness to do whatever it takes to have more of God. But one of the things I want to be clear when we throw around words like radical is this. When I talk about radical devotion, what I'm actually calling us back to is biblical devotion. New Testament devotion. That I don't want you to hear radical and think that this is a kind of devotion that does not have its footing in Scripture or that is different than anyone has ever embodied or that the world has ever seen. No. I'm talking about just biblical devotion of what it means to actually follow Jesus the way that He has called us to follow Him. When you look at normal devotion biblically, there's a few different texts that come to mind. When Jesus calls His disciples, He simply says, "Follow me." But when He says this, when He calls people to follow Him, what you see is they actually drop their nets, they leave their jobs, they leave their families, and they follow after Jesus. Because that was what they sensed the calling was, to follow Him, to leave their livelihoods and to follow Him, to take risks, to surrender and to follow Him. This is the example that we see from the very first disciples, the very first people that Jesus calls. They leave everything behind and they follow Jesus. When Jesus is teaching on what it means to follow Him or what it means to be devoted to Him, He says, deny yourself. Take up your cross and follow me. This is a life of risk, of cost, of maybe even suffering for the sake of being faithful to Jesus. That when He calls us to follow Him, that there may be a cost involved, that there will always be an inconvenience involved. And He's saying that you need to have a willingness to actually deny yourself in order to be faithful to Jesus. In Romans, Paul, when he's talking about how to be saved, he talks about confessing with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. He says, believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead. Confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. And I want to take you back to first century Rome for just a moment, when Caesar is ruling and reigning over the land as emperor, and he was considered a god. And to worship anything other or anyone other than Caesar was an act of rebellion against the Roman Empire, and it was punishable by death. And so when Paul was calling people to confess with their mouth that Jesus is Lord, he was calling them to have an allegiance to Jesus alone, and an allegiance that was willing to even suffer out of being faithful to Jesus. And then lastly, one of the things you just see throughout church history is every disciple, every apostle outside of John not only committed their life, but ultimately gave up their life in order to be faithful to Jesus. And John himself, even though maybe his life wasn't taken from him, he experienced so much suffering and hardship and pain out of a life of faithfulness to Jesus, that when we look at devotion, when we talk about radical devotion, we're not talking about something that has never existed. We're talking about the foundation of Christian faith. We're talking about the example that has been set of what it means to follow and be faithful to Jesus. But it's also not just biblical. It's also one of the things that you see globally. That when you think about radical devotion, you think about what it looks like to be faithful to Jesus, this is still the way that Jesus is followed all around the world. All around the world. Did you know that 1 in 7 Christians are persecuted worldwide? Did you know that 1 in 5 are persecuted in Africa? Did you know that 2 in 5 are persecuted in Asia? Last year alone, 4,476 Christians were murdered for faith-related reasons. 7,679 churches and Christian properties were attacked last year. And 4,744 Christians were in prison for their faith last year. That this is still happening. This is 2025 statistics. This is still what it looks like to follow Jesus and be faithful to Him all around the world. To be faithful to Him, this is normal devotion. Radical devotion is normal devotion. And so the question that I have for us this morning is, man, what holds us back from radical devotion? What's holding you back? What's holding me back from a biblical, heartfelt, radical devotion to Jesus? And there's a long list that we could talk about, but I specifically want to identify or speak about 3 things. First and foremost, I think there's just a misinterpretation or a misunderstanding of what devotion means. And I specifically think about people who are afraid that devotion is legalism. And they're very quickly to think that just because something is hard, it means they're being legalistic. Just because something is difficult and it doesn't feel natural, it doesn't feel easier, it doesn't feel comfortable, that it means that they're operating from a place of religious obligation rather than a place of devotion and love to Jesus. And I think that this can happen to us in the church, is that when we do something out of obligation or if a feeling of obligation, we have so many people tell us, hey, that's not good. That's not the right way to do this. And so we kind of wait around to feel like doing things, to feel like being faithful to Jesus, to feel like being devoted to Jesus. And what happens is you start to realize that just doesn't happen. And so a lot of us sit around not being faithful to Jesus, waiting to feel like being faithful to Jesus. And we begin to kind of make compromises just out of a sense of not wanting to be legalistic about what we're doing. But devotion isn't legalism, right? We make devotion and commitment optional. We make it an issue of salvation versus surrender. And we live lives where we go, man, I want to be saved by Jesus, but I don't necessarily want to live a life of devotion or surrender to Jesus. But when Jesus is calling us to himself, he's saying, look, the devotion to me, on the other side of devotion to me is the life that you long for. Like the love that you long for, the experience that you long for, the intimacy that you long for, the power that you long for, the things that you long for, the things that when you read the scriptures, when you read the New Testament, this calling, the birth of this church was all birthed out of being a college student, reading the New Testament, going, that's not what I'm experiencing. And I want to experience that. And I kept feeling this tension of I feel like I'm being oversold and there's this under-delivering happening. And I began to think that something must be wrong with me, right? Like what's wrong with either that or this isn't true. If Jesus is saying, if this is the example in the New Testament, he's saying this kind of life is possible, and yet my life does not look like this, or I'm not experiencing this, or I don't have this kind of love, or this kind of devotion, or this kind of impact with my life, then what's wrong? And you start to realize that it's an experience that comes on the other side of day by day consistent devotion to Jesus. When it comes to your marriage or your relationships in your life, You have a covenant in a marriage. You can stand before everyone, you can make a covenant, you can say that out loud, and that makes you married. It does not mean that your marriage is beautiful, healthy, flourishing, or thriving, right? How do you get that? Devotion. Devotion to one another, commitment to one another, love for one another, serving one another. That flourishing marriage that you long for, that flourishing relationship that you long for, doesn't just come through the promise. It doesn't just come through the vocal commitment. It comes through the devotion, right? And so the same thing with our relationship with Jesus is I think we say things, or we make decisions, or we make declarations, and we expect this immediate result, but the invitation is actually this is the beginning of a life of devotion. And the life that you long for is on the other side of that devotion. One of the things that we need to know is that just because something is hard doesn't mean it's bad, right? I think we begin to feel in our lives like, oh, this is difficult, and if I'm doing this right, it would be easy. Right? Or if Jesus was really in this, it would be easy. And it's so, and I understand, but that just shows like the way that we've been formed by ideas of the world or other different things, because when you look at this book, there's no way you come to that conclusion, right? That man, a life of following Jesus is difficult and it's hard, yet it's rewarding and it's beautiful and there's power on the other side of it. And then I think we kind of look around and we go, man, this should be easier for me. This should be easy for me, and it's just not. This life is hard, but it doesn't mean it's bad. I think about this line from Dallas Willard, one of my favorite authors. He wrote this in The Great Omission, talking about discipleship. And he says something that we need to understand is that grace isn't anti-work, it's anti-earn, right? That it's not against a life of effort, but it is against a life of earning. He's saying, man, if you want to earn God's love, or you want to earn God's pleasure, you want to earn God's approval, he's like, that's legalism. He's like, you can't earn you can't earn anything through your own effort. He's like, but it is a life of effort in order to experience all the grace that God has for you. It's an invitation to a relationship. And so faithfulness isn't legalism. There's covenant and there's commitment. And so I think there's a lot of us, we just kind of have a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation. And so when something feels hard, we want to quit because we feel like we're doing it wrong or that it should be easier. And I want you to know that if it's hard for you to follow Jesus, that's normal. Like if it's hard for you, that's normal. Like, man, if you turned the page on this new year and you started trying to wake up at whatever time to get alone with the Lord and to read the Bible or to pray, that's hard. If it's hard for you to turn off your thoughts in order to be silent and still before God and allow him to shape you and love you and minister to you, that's hard. If it's difficult for you to prioritize Jesus in your everyday, ordinary life, that's hard. If it's hard for you to love your wife and to serve your wife, or to love your husband and serve your husband the way that Jesus calls you to, that's hard. If it's hard for you to serve your kids and love your kids and sacrifice for you, that's hard. If it's hard for you to set aside your own desires, your own privileges, your own wants and needs in order to love other people, that's hard. And there's nothing wrong with you if this feels hard. So I want you to know that a life of devotion can be difficult, but it's not legalism. The second thing I think is just distraction. I think distraction, and you can qualify this with different words like busyness, other things, stuff. In Mark chapter 4, when Jesus is telling a story called the parable of the sower, there's a few different kind of soils that he says, man, when you throw out the seed of the gospel, when you throw out this kingdom life or God's power, he said, and it lands on different types of soils, and he's talking about the condition of our hearts. And he says some hearts are really hard and they just don't receive from the Lord because they're hard and they're resistant. He said, man, other people, the seed lands on soil that's really shallow. And so maybe it has growth for a minute, but it doesn't really last because people are shallow and they're not willing to suffer. They're not willing to embrace difficulty. But then he said there's this other soil. And he said it's the soil that has a bunch of thorns and thistles among it. And he says the seed sprouts and it begins to grow, but then it's choked out. And when the disciples asked him, what did you mean by that? He says this line. He says it's the worries and concerns of this age. It's the deceitfulness of wealth and possessions, and it's the desire for other things. And he says, and this chokes out the life of God in people's hearts and in people's lives. I want you to notice this. Are any of these things inherently bad? No. He doesn't say, hey, what are these things? And he's like, prostitution and drugs and alcohol and drunkenness. And it's not what he says. What are the things that choke out the kingdom life in people's hearts and people's lives? He says it's worry and concern. He's like, you're just concerned about the same things that everybody else is concerned about. You're just anxious about a bunch of stuff, about a bunch of things. And then he says it's the deceitfulness of wealth and possessions, that, man, if I can get enough, I'll be okay. I can have the security that I long for. And he's like, and that deceitfulness of wealth and possessions, he was like, it just chokes out the life. And then he says, then it's just the desire for stuff, the desire for things. And can I tell you something? American culture is this soil. This is the soil of our everyday life. We are swimming in this water in your everyday life. There's another thing every single day. There's another opportunity for distraction every single day. There's another app every single day. There's another thing you have to see every single day. You know every detail going on all over the world right now through the thing in your pocket. And that's not normal. And yet you have so many things stealing your attention and stealing the intention of your life. And it begins to get in and just take away space from the Lord to move in your heart and move in your life. And he just says it's just stuff. One of my favorite passages in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 35. And Paul is actually speaking. The context of this is on marriage and singleness. And he's actually encouraging people to be single. And he's saying, man, I think it would be better for you to be like me, to be single. And then he says, you know why? Because you can secure an undistracted devotion to the Lord. An undistracted devotion to the Lord. And you know this? God loves marriage. He invented it. Loves marriage. And yet Paul is saying that marriage that God loves and that God has ordained and that God has created can also be a distraction. And so imagine if God's pointing at something that's really good and really beautiful and saying this can be a distraction from devotion. How much more can everything else in your life be a distraction from devotion? And he's saying, man, you want to secure an undistracted devotion to the Lord. And so now this looks like when you're married, this looks like us trying to do this together, right? To have an undistracted devotion to the Lord together. And Paul's writing about the context of marriage and singleness, not Instagram and TikTok. And so imagine if we're distracted by good things, even godly things, how much more can we be distracted by all the stuff? And this happens to us not because we have bad intentions, it just happens. The third thing I think is calculation, and this is the one that I think is going to really lead us into this passage today. I think calculation. This is what I think a lot of Christians fall into right here. A lot of people who have hearts that really love Jesus, I think can fall into a life of calculation. And what I mean by this is this. You begin to ask questions like, what's the least I could give and still be considered faithful? What's the least I could give and still be considered faithful? What's the least I can do and still be considered faithful? I was thinking about when Katie and I were in the process of trying to figure out where God was calling us to plant a church, and we were working at a large church in like the West Cobb area, and then we were feeling like God was calling us to Boston, and then we found out we were pregnant with our son Asa, and God began to stir our hearts in different directions. And so we had where we were currently at. I was a college young adult pastor at a large church, and then we had Boston over here, and we had Atlanta over here. And I remember one day we're going on a walk through our neighborhood, and this conversation began to pop up, and it went just like this. It said, we could just stay here. Like, we could just stay here. Like, man, I think I could keep my job. Things are going pretty well. We could have a really good salary. We could have really good benefits. We could have really good income. We could live in this really nice house here in Seven Hills in this neighborhood that we were in. Schools are great. Whatever it may be. We're just having all this conversation as we were walking through our neighborhood, just going like, we could do this. We could say it would just be easier. It would be easier. And then by the time we were kind of getting to our house, we looked at each other and we both felt the same thing. And it was just like, but we would know. We would know that other people might be able to look at us and be like, man, you're so faithful. Like, you're still using your life for ministry, and you're still being faithful. Like, you're still preaching, you're still teaching, you're still leading, you're still doing this. You're using your life for Jesus, not knowing that we were actually in our hearts quietly restricting obedience in our own lives. Like quietly, internally rebelling against Jesus, what we felt like he was calling us to, what we felt like he was commanding us to do, and yet we were saying, no, we're going to take the safe route because this is just easier for us. And it was this idea of we would still be considered faithful. We'd still be considered faithful, but what's the least we could give him that would be the safest option for us? And the concern here is this: how much is left for me rather than how much I can give Jesus? Right? Our fear is that if we give too much to him, he's going to take it all and there's going to be nothing left for us on the back end. And you go, man, I'm going to give everything to him, and on the back end, I'm going to be burnt out. I'm going to be tired. I'm going to be depleted. He's not going to take care of me. And our whole idea is, how can I give him as little as possible and still have as much as I can for myself? And it comes out of a lack of trust, a lack of faith, a lack of believing that God loves you and he's going to take care of you. One of the things that I used to have a lot of conversations about with college students and young adults was about burnout. So many people were so afraid that they were going to burn out. You'd ask people to do one thing, and it was like, man, I don't want to burn out. I don't want to burn out. I don't want to burn out. And I was at a conference one time, and I was struggling with this tension because I didn't want to ask people to go beyond what they could do, and I'd seen so many examples of people who didn't take care of their people, and they burnt out people and used them and abused them and didn't take care of them, and then people walked away from the Lord or walked away from the church. I was like, I don't want that to happen. And so I was having this internal conversation, and I went to this conference, and I remember a pastor by the name of John Tyson. He said this: some of you fear burning out when you've never even burned. He's like, some of you fear burning out when you've never even burned. And it was a challenge to my own heart because I was experiencing a lot of the same things. Because what I was afraid is that, man, I'm going to be obedient to Jesus, and what's going to happen is I'm going to crash and burn on the other side. And what you begin to realize as you give Jesus more and give Jesus more and give Jesus more, he stretches your capacity to give him even more and even more and even more, and to handle more and more and more, because he has grace for that. And so he's not going to let you outgive him. Anything that's done for him and done to him and done with him, he's going to take care of you on. And I think there's a lot of us that we're just so concerned, like, man, I want to make sure I'm okay. I want to make sure I'm okay. I want to make sure. And you're not even giving Jesus an opportunity to take care of you. And he's going, man, I will take care of you. I will give you more. I will stretch your capacity. I will give you grace for that. I will give you energy for that. I will give you power for that. I will give you provision for that. But we don't trust him on the front end because we don't think there's going to be anything left for us on the back end. And what you realize is that God will stretch your capacity to experience more of him, but he won't stretch your capacity to give more to yourself. And it's going, man, how do we give him more? And this is the context that as we look at Mark chapter 14 together, this is the thing that I kind of want to bring to the surface in us as we look at this example of devotion from Mary. In this passage, Mark chapter 14, it's important for us to see that Jesus is back in Bethany. And the last time he was in Bethany, he did something pretty special. He raised Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus had been dead for over 4 days, and Jesus is standing outside the tomb. He tells Lazarus to get out of the grave. Lazarus gets out of the grave, and he's not dead anymore. And so that was a pretty spectacular thing to happen the last time he was in town. And Jesus comes back because these are friends of his, and he's having lunch in this house in Bethany, hosted by a guy by the name of Simon the leper. And it's important to see that this is days before his betrayal, death, and arrest. This is between 2 to 5 days before Jesus is going to give his life on the cross. And so he's getting closer and closer to what he realizes is God's will and God's plan for him. And everybody's on edge because he's saying a lot of things, and people aren't quite understanding what he's meaning and what he's doing and what he's declaring. And he goes into Simon the leper's house, and we don't know much about Simon the leper. There's not really a unique story, but the belief is that Simon has been healed by Jesus on one of his trips to Bethany. Is that Simon had leprosy, Jesus came, and Jesus healed Simon the leper. And as a thank you, and gratitude, and honor to Jesus, Simon the leper has invited him over for lunch. And Jesus invites his friends, Lazarus, Mary, Martha, and maybe some others. And in Luke's record of the account, in Luke chapter 7, he says that Simon was also a Pharisee, which makes things very interesting. Is that Simon was a part of this section of religious elite who had a very religious mindset and were not really too high on Jesus. But Simon was honoring Jesus and thanking him. And then this happens. This scene happens. And when we read this story, church history has made this we kind of take away the scandal of it all. And we make it really, there's paintings of this, and they're really beautiful, of Mary breaking this bottle at Jesus' feet. But I need you to know, this is awkward. Like, this is really awkward. And arguably, this is, to everybody else in this is shameful. Like, this is the vibe in the room when Mary does this. It's not like, man, how cute this is, how pretty this is. This is uncomfortable when Mary does this. And so in the midst of this room, Simon the leper, religious elite, hosting Jesus over in order to honor him and thank him. Jesus' friends in the room. Jesus 2 to 5 days before he's about to give his life on the cross. Mary charges into this room with an alabaster jar of pure nard, and she breaks it open at the feet of Jesus, and she begins to weep and wipe his feet at the table. This is an awkward and weird situation. And I want you to know that everyone sitting there would be looking at this and they would be going, this is a shameful act. And they would be offended that Jesus is allowing it. They would be offended that Mary is doing it. This was an offensive moment. But the thing that I think is important for us to see is that what Mary is doing is she is not worried about anything else that is going on in the room, anything else that is going on around her, anyone else that is sitting at the table. She sees Jesus is right there. She knows Jesus is worthy of something, and she breaks a gift at Jesus' feet. That's what she's concerned about. This is a call to radical devotion to Jesus. This isn't Mary taking inventory of the situation at hand. This isn't Mary looking at the circumstances surrounding her and saying, man, what would be an appropriate act right here? She's not measuring anything. She's going, what do I have and what is Jesus worthy of? And how can I give him what he's worthy of? This is an awkward event. There's three things I want to point out, and I want to ask us questions as we do this. So 3 questions I have for you, 3 things I want to point out. Is 1, do you understand what Jesus is worth? Because Mary did. Do you understand what Jesus is worth? Because Mary did. You know, Mary's gift, the scriptures point out, was worth about 300 denarii. That's a year's wages. In our day and age, it's probably about $50,000 to $60,000. This is probably a family heirloom that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation, not something that is meant to be disposed of, not something that is meant to be broken just in happenstance, not something that's meant to just be wasted or thrown out there, not something that's meant to be wasted on a carpenter who has a 2.5-year ministry who's now sitting in this room with dirty feet and has an alabaster jar of pure nard broken. That's not. I imagine if you ask their ancestors, hey, how are we going to end up using this nard? Is it going to be in some royal procession? Is one of our great grandkids going to become king? Well, how is this going to be used? Oh no, it's going to be used on a Jewish rabbi who was poor and had 2.5-year ministry. He was about to die a few days later, and then this bottle of $60,000 was broken at his feet. This is an extraordinary act. This is the most valuable and expensive possession this family owned, and yet it was broken and busted at Jesus' feet. Why was pure nard so expensive? Well, 3 things, really. It was rare, it was costly, and it was pure. It was rare, it was costly, and it is pure. When you think about the kind of sacrifice that Jesus demands of us, these are the 3 things I want you to keep in mind. It's rare, it's costly, and it's pure. Rare, meaning it's not common. The kind of devotion that Jesus is looking for, the kind of offering that Jesus is looking for, it's not a common kind of devotion, and it's not a common kind of offering, and it's not a common kind of sacrifice. It's an uncommon. It's rare. It's costly. It costs something. This is generations of work that has afforded this. Maybe it was a gift. Maybe it was something of great sentimental value, but it was costly. But lastly, it was pure. That this offering was gifted with a pure heart and pure intention, but the nard itself was pure. This nard was probably imported from India and primarily used to anoint kings. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about worship, and we're talking about a worship that demands a sacrifice, because worship is sacrifice. In Romans chapter 12, when Paul defines sacrifice, he says that we are meant to be a living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to the Lord. When you look at the Old Testament, sacrifices were often of animals. Did you know sacrifice in the New Testament is no longer animals but ourselves? You know, a lot of times we think that, thank God we're not in the Old Testament because we had to do so much more and give so much more in the Old Testament. But then you look at New Testament devotion, and it's actually, no, you're not sacrificing a goat, you're not sacrificing a bull, you're not sacrificing a pigeon, you're sacrificing yourself. And you're laying yourself down on the line for the sake of being faithful to Jesus. And what we see here is that Mary understands who Jesus is and what he's doing. And she knew because she listened to him. There's 3 times that we see Mary at the feet of Jesus in the Gospels. The first time is a pretty popular story where Martha, her sister, is in the kitchen, and she's working and she's striving and she's sweating and she's trying to do a bunch of things. And Mary is just in the living room sitting at the feet of Jesus. And Martha eventually grows frustrated, comes out and looks at Jesus and says, Jesus, will you tell Mary to get into the kitchen and help me? And Jesus looks at Martha and says, Martha, Martha, you're worried about many things, but Mary's chosen the right thing. Why? Because Mary sat at Jesus' feet and listened to him. Because she knew that he was special. The second time we see Mary thrown at the feet of Jesus is when Lazarus has died. And Martha comes up to Jesus and she says, Jesus, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. And she begins to get into a theological discussion and debate with Jesus. Mary just throws herself down at Jesus' feet and weeps. Instead of theologizing the situation, she throws herself down at Jesus' feet in desperation and in surrender. And then the last time is this moment right here. At the table with the professional religious people, Mary throws herself down at Jesus' feet, pours oil on his head, all the way dripping down to his feet, wipes his feet with her hair as she weeps over his body. This is a sacrifice because she knew what Jesus is worth. This is a call to resist casual Christianity. Casual. So many of us grow casual about the things of God. So many of us grow casual about our relationship with Jesus. And it's easy to do. We just wake up and we just compromise little by little, day after day, until you end up casual about things that you used to care so much about. It's interesting as you look at this, Simon, if it's true that Simon the leper was healed from his leprosy by Jesus, I want you to understand what's true about leprosy. If you suffer from leprosy, it's super contagious. You also get banished from your community and from your home. You get banished from your family. You get banished from your community. Simon got banished from the synagogue. He lost absolutely everything. And then Jesus heals him. And I don't know what happened to Simon. I imagine when Jesus initially healed him, he was in awe and wonder and gratitude and thanksgiving, and maybe he even wept at Jesus' feet just like Mary did. But then something happened. Simon grew casual about what he used to really care about. Simon grew casual about the one who healed him. Simon grew casual about the one that used to give him awe and wonder. Simon grew casual about the one that had given him everything back. And Mary did not grow casual or calloused. Mary knew what Jesus is worth and offered him everything as a result. The second thing is, are you willing to look foolish for Jesus? Mary was. Are you willing to look foolish for Jesus? Mary was. You know, there's something I kind of want to call us to, and it's this: resisting professionalism. Resisting professionalism. Obviously you guys go to a church plant. You know, you walk in and there's no hiding the fact that this is a Catholic school Monday through Saturday. You walk in and we don't have a ton of things, and we're not trying to stress out about how do we try to be something that we're not, or pretend that we're somewhere that we're not. The goal here is to have something that's pure, something that we can offer to the Lord, something that resists professionalism. And the tension that we feel is going, man, Lord willing, if we grow or if something happens, man, are we going to get to a point where we become more professional than we are devoted? Are we going to get to a point where we become more performative than we are devoted? Are we going to get to a point where we get more passionate about excellence than we do encounter? Like what's gonna happen to us? Are we going to make those little compromises? And I think something happens to all of us as well, especially for those of us who have grown up in this, is that you get really familiar with the Word of God and you learn a lot of things. Maybe you go to church and maybe you've done a lot of stuff, and you go really, really casual about the things that used to make your heart stir. And this happens to us. Easy. It happens to us. It happens to us in our relationships. It happens to us in our marriages, and it happens to us in our relationship with Jesus, is that we grow casual. In this story, Mary takes down her hair. She gets on her hands and knees in front of prestigious men, and she anoints Jesus' dirty feet with expensive ointment and wipes them with her hair. And the offense that everyone has is that she wastes this on Jesus. the big deal about the hair in this passage is in Jewish culture, women rarely, if ever, let their hair down in public, especially around men, because a woman's hair was a symbol of her glory and her beauty. And Mary is here laying down her glory and her beauty as an offering to the glory and beauty of Jesus. And she actually takes the thing that is most glorious and most beautiful, and she actually wipes it on the dirty feet of Jesus, showing that her glory and her beauty belongs beneath the feet of Jesus. And so the thing that she had most right to celebrate in, to the thing that gave her the most honor, the most thing that showed people her beauty, and the thing that she was most celebrating about her, she places at the feet of Jesus when they're dirty and they're busted. He begins to wipe down his feet with the thing that she could use as an offering to Jesus, but she didn't. Women didn't touch men this way. The only people who would or could were slaves. A traditional teacher or rabbi would never allow this. This crosses every single social and religious norm and standard of the day. This is awkward and would have a direct impact on her reputation as well as Jesus's. The text says they grew indignant. It made them hate Jesus more that he would allow something like this. Are you willing to look foolish for Jesus? When's the last time you looked foolish for Jesus? When's the last time you were willing to look foolish for Jesus? I think a lot of us, we have a professional relationship when it comes to following Jesus. We want things to look pretty and we want things to look right, but we're not willing to look foolish. Even maybe during worship, you're looking to the left and you're looking to the right. You're thinking about the way you're perceived, or you're thinking about the way that you're looking. When it comes to your day-to-day relationship with Jesus, maybe you're thinking about what other people say about you or what other people think about you. But are you willing to look foolish for the sake of Jesus? Faith requires some foolishness. In their book, Moments, Chip and Dan Heath write this phrase right here, and I think it's so powerful. They said, beware of the soul-sucking force of reasonableness. Beware the soul-sucking force of reasonableness. And it's all about making extraordinary moments in your life. But in this case, I wonder how many of us, we have really reasonable relationships with Jesus. You have really reasonable faith. You have a reasonable devotion. It's casual, it's professional, it's reasonable. But there's something on the other side of risk. And there's something on the other side of a willingness to look foolish. There's something on the other side of a willingness to embarrass yourself in front of others, or embarrass yourself when it comes to taking steps of faith. And my question to you is, are you willing to look foolish for Jesus because Mary was? Beware the soul-sucking force of reasonableness. I think the third thing that I want to ask is this: are you willing to be mocked and criticized for Jesus because Mary was? Are you willing to be mocked and criticized for Jesus because Mary was? When it comes to radical devotion, we have to understand the worth and the beauty of Jesus. We have to be willing to look foolish for Jesus. We have to be willing to be mocked and criticized by others for Jesus. In this room, everyone in it criticized her, both the Pharisee as well as the disciples. In the other context, you see Judas make comment about the waste of Mary's offering. You can actually you can hear the audible gasp of the room. Imagine someone coming in and throwing down $50,000, $60,000 worth of anything at the feet of Jesus. And you begin to try to organize or fixate on what else that could have been offered to. And you start to realize what you actually think Jesus is worth. You begin to get really strategic rather than in a posture of surrender. And these disciples and these Pharisees begin to criticize her. They begin to actually shame her for what she's doing. You know, when you get radically devoted to Jesus, you'll be surprised at who you offend. You'll be surprised at who gets offended when you get radical about your devotion to Jesus. You'll be surprised at the people who don't want you to follow Jesus with your whole heart. You'll be surprised at the people who begin to get inconvenienced by your devotion to Jesus. You'll begin to be surprised at the people who get offended by the sacrifices that you make in order to be devoted to Jesus. But we have to make them in order to be devoted to Jesus. You know, one of the things that happens in this story is that the ones who claim to be devoted and surrendered to Jesus actually were offended by Mary's level of devotion because they knew they weren't willing to give that same level of gift. They knew they weren't willing to make that same kind of sacrifice, that same kind of offering. Have you ever been around people who you know deep down in their heart they do have a desire for Jesus and they do love Jesus, but if you start getting too serious about your faith, they start being really uncomfortable. They start asking you why you're taking it so seriously. And they begin to be inconvenienced by your level of seriousness when it comes to the way that you follow Jesus, when it comes to the level of sacrifice you're willing to make. And people are constantly trying to call you back into a comfort, back into a lesser level of devotion, back into a lesser level of surrender. They're trying to manage your devotion. And I think a lot of us, we have this fear that we're going to give too much, right? We're We're going to give too much and there's going to be nothing left over. Or other people in our lives think you're going to give too much of yourself and there's not going to be anything left for them. And you'll offend people when you're devoted to Jesus. They'll begin to tell you to take it easy, and they'll ask you what happened to you or why you are the way that you are. Maybe when you started following Jesus and getting serious about your faith, it affected your relationships and people have actually left you because of the way that you began to follow Jesus. Maybe you used to do certain things in your old life that you no longer do in your new life, and you lost those friendships and those relationships because of your faith in Jesus, because of your radical devotion. And you're being criticized, you're being mocked, maybe you're being left, you're being abandoned. I don't know if maybe even Mary's family were offended by Mary's gift. She takes this family heirloom and throws it down at Jesus' feet. Maybe they begin to freak out. And so maybe you're here and you have people who claim to be spiritual, that judge your level of devotion. Or maybe you're here and you have family that judge your level of devotion, judge your level of commitment. Maybe you have people who are offended by your level of sacrifice. Mary was. And here's where I want to close is with this. I want you to notice Jesus. This is what I want you to look at. I want you to notice Jesus. Because when it comes to our devotion, I want you to understand this isn't a behavior modification we're calling to because we feel this forceful obligation to be this way. No, we believe that devotion is an invitation. That when we talk about being able to experience and encounter the living God, when we talk about being able to experience and have a relationship with the presence of Jesus, and the pathway to that being devotion, that we believe the call to devotion is simply a desire for Jesus. You know, our desire and our goal as we live lives of radical devotion is to worship and offer a sacrifice to Jesus as he deserves and not as we desire. So many times we're managing our worship by our own desires rather than what Jesus deserves. And to worship means giving to Jesus as he deserves and not as we desire. Out of a desire to be close and to experience him and to lay hold of his presence. The New Testament is constantly talking about an inheritance that belongs to us, that Jesus has laid down his life to secure for us. That there's an inheritance on the table, but this inheritance can only be secured through a commitment and a devotion to Jesus. And I want you to pay attention to the way Jesus responds, because that's who matters in this story. The main point of this story isn't Mary. The main point of this story isn't the Pharisee. The main point of this story isn't Simon the leper. The main point of this story isn't the people in the room. And the main point of this story isn't even the alabaster jar. The main point of this story is the posture of Jesus to people who live lives of radical devotion. And I want you to notice this, is that first and foremost, Jesus defends uncalculated love. That Jesus defends uncalculated love. When we talk about having calculated lives, where we try to manage our sacrifice to Jesus, where we try to give him this much in order to leave more for us, I want you to see that when she throws everything down at the feet of Jesus, he defends her to everyone in the room. They claim it's a waste, and Jesus says it's beautiful. They claim that it was offensive, and Jesus says that it should be remembered. That Jesus defends uncalculated love. There's some of us in this room, you're calculating your love for Jesus. You're waking up every single day and you're thinking, how can I give him just a little bit to be considered a good Christian, rather than thinking, how much can I give him because of how worthy he is? And Jesus defends this uncalculated love because he knows she's offering something based on what he's worthy of, not what everyone else is comfortable with. And so he says, I love this. And he defends her to everyone in the room. And Jesus will defend your devotion. Jesus will defend your devotion to everyone in the room. Anyone who criticizes you or mocks your level of devotion, anyone who is inconvenienced by your level of devotion, you need to know that Jesus will defend your devotion. That Jesus finds your devotion beautiful. Jesus finds your sacrifice beautiful. Jesus finds anything that you lay at his feet beautiful, because Jesus himself is beautiful, and he knows it's your resistance to thinking that the things in this world are more valuable or more beautiful and more precious than he is. That whatever gift, whatever most expensive, whatever most precious thing you have in your life, you can lay at his feet. Why? Because he is greater. And then the last thing you see is that Jesus honors. He rewards her radical devotion. Listen to me. I'm not telling you that if you get radically devoted to Jesus, you're going to get wealthy, you're going to get comfortable, your life's going to get better, your life's going to get easier. If you read the New Testament, it's actually potential that it's not. It's probable that it might get more inconvenient. But what I will tell you is this, is that Jesus loves to reward radical devotion. He promises it. He commits himself to it. He looks at Mary's offering, and out of all the things that anyone else had done for Jesus in all of the Gospels, out of all of the acts that had ever happened in all of the Gospels, you remember he sent the disciples out 2 by 2, and they healed people. They delivered people. They preached the gospel. And yet, Jesus didn't, when they came back, Jesus didn't say, hey, wherever the gospel's preached, I want you to remember these guys. But Mary Mary walks in, throws down an alabaster jar, is willing to be mocked, is willing to be criticized, is willing to look foolish. And Jesus says, wherever the gospel's preached, you need to honor this. Wherever the gospel's preached, you need to talk about this. I will remember this. And notice what he says. He says in remembrance of her. Remembrance of her. There's a famous quote by Count Zinzendorf, and it says, preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten. Preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten. And I think that's beautiful. It's actually in my office. I find it beautiful. But what Jesus says is if you live a life of radical devotion, Jesus doesn't say be forgotten. He says be remembered. He says you'll be remembered. He says he will remember you. That he remembers our lives lived in sacrifice to him. He remembers our lives lived in radical devotion. And if you are somebody who's going to live a life of radical devotion, you have to put all of your faith and all of your trust that when you stand before him in eternity, he's going to honor, he's going to reward, and that's going to be your blessing. That it's not for what you may get here in the immediate or the right now, because you might not get anything outside of more intimacy with Jesus and more blessing from him. But he will honor it, and he will make sure that it's not wasted, even if everyone else says it is. The band's going to come back out as we move into a time of response. And I'm going to lead us into a moment of reflection. And I want, if you can, just be present with me for a second. And I'm going to invite you to think about your own life for a moment. What is our motive for devotion? I know right now it's so easy for you to be listening to this and you think, man, this guy's pouring a lot of weight into our lives. And it feels like a demanding thing, and you feel like Jesus is calling you to with all of these demands, and you feel like it's a weight and it's a burden and it's heavy. And you feel like it's just, man, go out there, try harder and do better. But this is why it's so important for you to realize what was her motive for devotion. What had stirred Mary's heart to such a point that she was willing to make such a beautiful sacrifice to Jesus? In Luke chapter 7, the Pharisees say that this is a sinful woman. That's what they call her, the sinful woman. She doesn't even have a name. And then Jesus asks them a question, and he says, let me ask you something. Who's going to be more grateful, the one who's forgiven little or the one who's forgiven much? And they say, the one who's forgiven much. And he says, this woman knows she's been forgiven. And I bring you back to Simon the leper, who had grown casual and familiar with his healing. Someone who was once an outcast from society, who had experienced healing from Jesus. And he may have thanked and honored Jesus in a moment, but he didn't really love him. And now I bring you to Mary of Bethany, who was still in awe and wonder at Jesus' mercy. She too was once an outcast from society because she was a sinner. She too had experienced forgiveness and healing from Jesus. But here she is thanking and honoring Jesus because she loves him. Hey man, I wonder if you're here and you're lacking devotion in your life, and you're calculating, and you're fearing, and you're gripping. And I wonder if it's because you've forgotten. I wonder if it's forgotten how much Jesus has done for you. I wonder if it's because you've forgotten how much he's forgiven you of. I wonder if you've forgotten what he's done for you. Jesus says that Mary is anointing him in preparation for his burial. Why? Because even though nobody else in the room understands what Jesus is about to do, Mary does. Because she listens. And she knows that that Jesus is about to lay his life down for this sinful woman, so that she could be forgiven, so that she could be cleansed, so that she could be healed, so that she could be whole. And man, I think there's a lot of you in here, you have a respectable relationship with Jesus. You have a reasonable faith and relationship with Jesus. But you lack devotion because you've gone casual about the thing that was once beautiful to you. You've lost your awe you've lost your awe and your wonder at the mercy and the forgiveness of Jesus. Maybe you actually convinced yourself that, man, maybe I'm not so bad. Maybe I did actually earn and deserve a little bit of that. And when you do that, your offering gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller because Jesus gets less and less worthy. But when you realize how much he's forgiven you, when you realize the lengths that he's gone to give you mercy, when you realize how much he loves you and how little you deserve it, your devotion grows stronger and stronger in response to his forgiveness and his mercy. Her motivation for devotion wasn't try harder. Her motivation for devotion was, you have forgiven me of so much and you are beautiful and you are worthy. And maybe you've gotten to this point where you are grinding out this faith and relationship with Jesus because you think it's valuable. Or maybe you want to set a good example for your kids. Or you think it's a nice duty. Or maybe you think it's an honorable thing to do. Man, forget that. The calling is to be so enamored in awe and wonder at the mercy and the beauty of Jesus that you're willing to break everything down at his feet. You're willing to look foolish if you need to look foolish. You're willing to sacrifice whatever you need to sacrifice, even the most precious things that you have, because of what he's worthy of and what he deserves. And I think some of us here, we're managing our lives with Jesus. We're calculating our lives with Jesus. And I think you're withholding from Jesus when there's an invitation to give him more. And I want you to know this: you're not going to outgive him. You're not going to outgive him. He will honor it. He will reward it. We're going to move into a time of response. We're going to have prayer leaders up front. And there's maybe three things that I kind of feel called to. I think first and foremost, there's some of you who you just need to get to a fresh place of surrender. You've calculated, you've thought, you've considered, but you lack surrender. Maybe if you're Mary in this story, you're looking into the room and you're thinking about it, but you're seeing these people over here and you're seeing these people over here and you're wondering if it's worth it or what it's going to cost you. And man, some of you need this kind of faith and this kind of surrender that barges into the room to break that alabaster jar at Jesus' feet and to give him the offering that he's worthy of. You need to stop calculating, you need to stop considering, and you need to just surrender. And I think there's others of you here who, man, the thing about it, like, God's not going to love you anymore based on your level of devotion. And I think you need to know that. I think you've been living a life of devotion, and you have seasons of intensity and you have seasons of crash. And you've been riding that wave for years and years and years, and that's been your relationship with Jesus. And every time you're doing great, you think he loves you more. And every time you crash, you think he loves you less. And you just need to know that Jesus loves you. Jesus didn't love Mary any more than he loved Simon the leper. But he experienced more pleasure at the gift of Mary than he did at the resistance of Simon the leper. God's heart isn't any more open to you based on your performance or your devotion. And you need to know that he loves you. And he's inviting you into a life with him. And some of you here, there's something that's coming to your mind, there's something that's coming to your heart that you need to lay down. Whatever your alabaster jar is, maybe it's a big thing, maybe it's a small thing, and you need to lay it down, you need to throw it down at the feet of Jesus. Man, come and lay that down. And we'll have a team here who can pray for you, who can bless you, who can help you. Jesus, would you move in this place and in this space? Would you search every single heart? Would you convict where you need to convict? Would you encourage where you need to encourage? Would you pour your love out where you need to pour your love out, Jesus? God, would you remind us of your mercy that you've extended to us, that we've so quickly forgotten? For some of us, you need to take us back to that moment that our eyes were open to how broken we are, to our rebellion, and to your salvation, your kindness, your grace. Jesus, may we not grow casual about your mercy and about your beauty. Would you work in our hearts? May we not carry any alabaster jars out of this place when they belong at your feet, Jesus. Come, Holy Spirit.